Mama. 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 Mama, 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 mama. Ma? Mama, 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 mama. Mama, 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 mama. Mama, 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 mama. Mama, 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 mama. Mama, 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 mama. Mama, 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 mama. Mama, 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 mama. Mama, 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 mama. Ma, mama. Mama, 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 mama. Ma, mama, mama, mama. Ma. Mama, 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 mama. Ma, mama, mama, mama. Ma, mama, 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 mama. Ma, mama, mama. Mama. Mama, 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 mama. Mama, mama, mama. Mama, mama, mama. Mama. Mama, 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 mama. Mama, mama. Mama. Mama, mama, mama. Mama, 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 mama. Mama, 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 mama. Mama, mama, mama. Mama, mama, mama. Mama, 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 mama.
After arriving on the continent 1,000 years ago, the humans had quickly spread across the land, pushing out all of the old races that once called this place home. By this point in time, the once great Elven kingdoms had been reduced to two last bastions, Tariel in the Great Forest and Argandel in the north. Until recently, the primary faction of the humans had been a massive empire which spanned most of the continent. Thankfully for those who were praying for the downfall of the humans, this empire had recently split, and a civil war had ensued. Taking advantage of the chaos of the empire breaking up, our group set out from Tariel. Guthor ensures them that he knows the perfect place for them to set up their new nation, and encourages them on to the northwest. The group of travellers arrived at the location Guthor had been aiming for. It was a long, narrow stretch of land that jutted out into the sea. Legend told that it was the site from which an elf maiden Yera had done battle with a massive sea creature which had been terrorising the northern seas. She spent weeks tracking it, choosing the location and drawing it in. The battle was said to have raged for days, with Yera piercing the serpent with thousands of arrows. When the serpent was finally felled, Yera cemented her place in the Elven pantheon as the goddess of the hunt. It had been a long and arduous journey to get here, but the work was only just beginning. Guthor immediately set the whole group to chopping down trees. If this was to be the start of their new country, they'd need some buildings. The journey here had almost completely diminished their food supplies, so planting some new crops was a must. As the group's resident agricultural expert, Prentice suggested that they start with some radishes, which would grow quite quickly, allowing them to soon replenish their strength. Along with the small field of radishes, she also planned out a small field of strawberries. These would take longer to grow, but would offer a slightly larger harvest than the radishes. Plus, it would do wonders for the group's mental health to have a little variety in their meals. With the group making quick work of clearing a large swath of trees, Jayla suggested that one of their first priorities should be to arm themselves. As they knew they would be forced to travel across human lands to get here, they wanted to draw as little attention to themselves as possible, so had left their bows at home. Yera was feeling particularly vulnerable without her trusty bow on her back, however. Thankfully, Guthor was quite the craftsman, and was certain he could make them some new bows to defend themselves. They would also need shelter. For the first night, they decided to simply throw some wood together to create a rough barracks where they could at least get some sleep, away from the elements. Using the stone of the hillside as one of their walls, they set about rapidly erecting the other walls to give themselves some basic shelter. Although the lay of the land meant there was less farmland than would be available further inland, there was plenty of water here, with the sea on the outskirts of the peninsula, and small ponds pocking the land. Although the radishes would grow quickly, they would still need to source other food in the meantime. Without their bows, and with no one all that interested in fistfighting one of the large carnivorous dinosaurs wandering the area, fishing seemed like the best option. Fishing was a tedious and time-consuming task, but it would keep them fed until the crops began to grow. Speaking of tedious and time-consuming activities, Guthor and Louisa still appreciated spending some of their time each day praying to the gods. The anima tree in the north of the peninsula was rumoured to have grown on the spot where Yera had given thanks to the other gods after her victory over the serpent. So naturally, Guthor and Louisa were insistent that it be the site of their nightly prayers. Before the day is out, they've already managed to finish up the shelter and fashion a roof for it, allowing them each to claim their own little patch of stone to sleep upon for the night. Realising that they'd need to start processing all the wood they'd gathered into planks, they spent the last of the day's light throwing together a small workshop that they could use to fit a trestle in. Although they didn't quite finish the workshop before they collapsed in exhaustion for the night, they couldn't help but feel that they'd had quite a successful first day on the peninsula. They arose bright and early the next morning. They were just that excited to make progress. It was definitely nothing to do with having barely slept due to the discomfort of the hard stone floor. Knowing that their plans were very grand indeed, they knew they'd need a lot of materials, so Louisa locked himself away in the workshop to begin processing all of their wood into planks, so that they could get to building. One of the first improvements they needed was a well. Currently the whole group were traipsing up to the pond at the north of the peninsula, just to gather clean drinking water, which was wasting a lot of time. Another rather immediate concern was their toilet situation. They would soon need a place to relieve themselves, so as their construction expert, Elven got to planning out a number of latrines for the group to do their business in. With the food situation getting a little worse, Hoyt, Yera and Prentice were using their spare time to fish, hoping to rip enough fish out of their cosy little pond to feed the group for the coming days. In fact, just as Louisa was trying to figure out another place they could safely fish from, Hoyt's hunger got the better of him, and he started a fight with Yera. The two worked out some stress with minimal damage to each other, but it was a stark reminder that even though their journey was over, the real challenges were just beginning. The positive for the day, however, was that Guthor had managed to craft 3 of the bows, with the 4th one on its way. With the bows in hand, the elves felt a lot more confident they could defend themselves, and ideally, even hunt some food to stave off the hunger. The next morning, the early risers of the group got to treat themselves to some wild berries that Prentice had found, although there wasn't a large enough supply to feed all of them. Guthor started the morning by finishing his work on the 4th shortbow, and the elves, all now armed, ventured out to hunt some food. They targeted one of the larger dinosaurs to the north, making sure to keep their distance. The bows were a wonderful help, but the elves were only too aware of the danger even a small slash from the beast could do, and without medicine, they didn't fancy their chances against an infection. Thankfully, they were able to fell the beast without incident. A sleepy Hoyt heard the cheers of victory and rose from his bed to throw together a butcher's block. As the group's most experienced chef, he wanted to make sure they had the right tools available to dismantle the beast. To that end, he also decided to build a fire in the centre of the shelter, on which he could cook the meat. After finishing up the bows, Guthor had also started work on 2 large wooden clubs for the Bronum, Hoyt and Elven. They were both capable with bows too, but they felt less pain than the elves, and were less prone to bleeding, so having them on the front lines of any confrontation whilst the elves stood back and picked foes off with their bows was just the most sensible battle tactic. Realising that they had quite a few mouths to feed, and that if they wanted to build a proper civilization up here, they'd want to bring in a lot more mouths to feed, Prentice suggested adding an additional field of potatoes. These would take a while to grow, but would offer quite a high yield, and were quite easy to grow, even in rough soil. With basic shelter, water, toilets, and a basic workshop sorted, the group felt like they'd done a good job so far. Their food supplies were still tenuous at best, but they were already working on that. Living with the other elves back in the forest may have meant giving up on their future, but it did mean living in comfort. Guthor knew that he'd have to offer his people some comfort if he wanted to keep them happy and productive, and getting them each individual bedrooms was the first step towards this. He worked with Hoyt to throw together a basic blueprint that they could use to create numerous new houses. It was nothing fancy and would likely change over time, but for the immediate future it would do the job just fine. It took most of the day, with only Hoyt being able to spare the time to work on it, as the rest of the group feverishly threw their efforts into fishing, to ensure they could eat that night. But Hoyt was a hard worker, and by the end of that night he managed to finish the first 2 rooms. I mean, there were no beds in either of them, but it was a gallant effort on Hoyt's part nonetheless. Of course, there were 6 of them, so they need to get to work on more bedrooms soon. Hoyt began planning out the next set of rooms. Prentice insisted that Hoyt build the new structures on the sandier soil, in order to leave the more fertile soil in the centre of the peninsula free for their crops. Although between them they had a wealth of experience in a number of areas, the group were far from knowing everything that would be required to build a new country, so Yera began planning out some research projects to help them improve things. She would start with some basic storage solutions. They weren't overflowing with materials at the moment, but if things went to plan, they soon would be, and it would be vital to have methods to store all of it. The next morning, the group were awoken by the screams of someone falling from the sky and crashing to the ground. Only humans would be stupid enough to launch themselves into the sky in balloons, so the group found it to be quite a joyous sound. Guthor identified that they could probably save the life of this man, but given it was a human, he instead stripped him of everything he had and left him there to bleed to death. The group weren't the only ones suffering with their hunger, and soon one of the local dinosaurs attempted to hunt Crustable, the giant axolotl that they brought on the journey with them. All of the group rushed to help, but Hoyt was closest, and with a few swings of his massive club, and the help of Crustable themselves, he took the dinosaur down before the others could even arrive. Crustable had taken a few good slashes, but it was nothing they couldn't patch up. And on the upside of all this, they now had some more dinosaur meat for breakfast. With the first real bed finished, the group were able to clear up some space in the original shelter for a research bench, to allow Yera to continue her work. Sadly, at the same time, a number of the group seemed to contract the plague. With food supplies low and medicine supplies non-existent, this was quite the blow to them. Guthor insisted that those afflicted should get some rest, until they'd recovered. There were 1 or 2 patches of wild healroot in the area. Not enough to treat everyone, but maybe enough to target their treatment on anyone who was having a particularly rough time with the plague. Just as the group were trying to come to terms with this new situation, a Phytokin approaches the area, looking for fellowship and a place to call home. The Phytokin are plant-like creatures, highly attuned to nature, and they too had been decimated by the encroaching human populations. As a fellow creature of the old world, the group were only too happy to welcome Apple into their settlement. She would also be a wonderful help to them when it came to their agricultural pursuits. Whilst out gathering healroot to treat the ill, Prentice noticed a troll burrow on the peninsula. They'd have to be careful not to awaken the trolls, as they could cause the group some issues. However, Yera was quick to note that they might be able to awaken them tactically, in order to deal with any attackers that approached the peninsula. With 3 of the beds completed and 3 of the group sick, Guthor insisted that the sick be relocated to these beds, to give them better rest and a better chance of beating their illness. So far, Yera seemed to be getting ahead of the sickness, but Louisa and Oi Woon were still struggling. With Oi Woon soon starting to look a little healthier, Guthor decided to use the first batch of medicine to treat Louisa, to help bring him past the worst of it. Following the treatment, Guthor was confident that it would do the world of good for Louisa. A group of traders from the northern realms approached the area. The Northern Realms were a small human kingdom located north of the peninsula. Given the difficulties inherent in living so far north, they weren't overly aggressive towards the Old World races, as they had more than enough of their own issues to deal with. They were still humans, of course, so Guthor was still very on edge around them. But no country would survive entirely on its own, and the Northern Realms could eventually prove to be useful trading partners in the area. For now, however, the group had nothing of interest to the trade caravan. The next morning, it seemed as though the sick were getting past the worst of it, and Guthor was hopeful they would all make full recoveries. Although taking care of the sick and fishing up enough food to feed them all had taken the majority of the group's time over the last few days, White had been working heroically in the background to finish off both the new buildings, and that morning, he even finished up Jayla's new research bench, ensuring that even with everything slowing down due to illness, the group were still making progress. Good work, Hoyt. With the construction expanding beyond the initial shelter, it was really beginning to feel like a proper settlement. With that in mind, Prentice suggested that they give the settlement and their faction a new name. Drawing on his knowledge of ancient creatures, and his hopes for the country, Guthor decided that they should call themselves the Phyrexian Collective, and that the settlement itself should be named Ysera's Perch, after the legendary battle that the goddess of the hunt had fought here long ago. With Hoyt itching to be put to work, and a couple of the group still sleeping on the cold shelter floor, he got to work on a new set of rooms. In some pretty exciting news, Prentice began gathering up the group's first harvest of radishes that morning. It wouldn't be a massive amount of food overall, but it would help them get ahead of themselves a little, hopefully meaning they could be more productive than simply spending all day every day fishing just to survive. Another checkup on the sick members of the community that night revealed that all of them were past the worst of it and unlikely to succumb to the illness, much to the relief of all involved. Although they'd been unable to do business together on this occasion, it seems that the traders from the Northern Realms also understood the potential of having a trading relationship with the Phyrexian Collective, and they offered a small gift of silver to help cement their relationship. Guthor was still suspicious of them, but he was smart enough to know that no new nation would survive without a healthy dose of diplomacy. With a couple of different buildings now making up the settlement, Hoyt suggested creating pathways between them all, which Guthor happily agreed to. Hoyt mostly thought it would make the path safer and quicker to traverse, but Guthor loved the idea, as he thought it would make the settlement feel more like a proper town. Hoyt started by merely packing down the dirt to make the paths. It was a quick and cheerful method, but they didn't have the resources or manpower to put down paths of stone, although at least they'd have something to aim for. Given that one of the designated fishing spots saw the fisher person standing knee-deep in the water, and that they had an abundance of wood, Elven decided to build a small pier that extended out into the pond, allowing those fishing to keep their feet dry while catching that night's dinner. With everyone back on their feet and things going smoothly, Prentice decided to expand their farming work, increasing the size of the potato field and adding 3 new fields. One of hay for any animals they may get, one of flax, so that they had something fibrous they could craft with, and one of einkorn, a grain plant that would take a long time to grow and would require extra processing, but which would yield a massive harvest. Louisa noticed the signs of some horses nearby, and decided that the group should hunt 2 of the stallions to help improve their food supplies. He was careful to ensure that they left at least 1 stallion, and all of the mares, in case they decided to start breeding the horses. They would likely need beasts of burden at some point as they expand their town. Despite being the leader and the whole thing being his plan, even Guthor was feeling the pressure after days of scraping by on little food and with little time to rest and relax. This culminated in him going on an insulting spree, following the others around and hurling abuse at them all day. The others understood the pressure he was under, so tried their best to simply ignore his jabs. But after a whole day of this, Elven had finally had enough, and she took a swing at him. After an incredibly short-lived scuffle, they both went their separate ways, with a few bruises each, and Guthor realising that maybe he'd been a bit of a twat. Although Gunther was their medical expert, Apple thought it best to keep him away from Oiwun for a bit, so she offered to patch up Oiwun in the meantime. The mood issue around the settlement was only getting worse, probably due to them all enduring a day of abuse from Gunther. Louisa started the next morning with a fit of rage, eager to attack anyone he could find. His first target was Christabel, which simply would not stand. Apple, Prentice and Hoyt all rushed from the nearby shelter to gang beat him into submission before he could do too much harm to their precious axolotl. The pain from his beating was unlikely to improve his mood, but hopefully it'd be a reminder to him to not try and attack his comrades. Later that morning, a trader arrived at the peninsula via airship. The Trading Guild of the world hosted members from every race, and sat entirely outside of the politics of the human kingdoms and the old races. Their only interest was making money, and they would happily trade with anyone to achieve it, making them a valuable asset to the collective. Apple wandered over to browse their wares. With the group's meagre silver supplies, and nothing of value that the traders wanted, aside from Christabel, which was obviously not an option, she left empty-handed, but she was sure to let them know that the collective were happy to do business with the guild, in the hopes that it would encourage other guild traders to stop by. With a couple of the horses to be butchered and cooked, research to be done and medical treatment to be dished out, the main shelter was still proving to be the centre of activity, despite the addition of the extra buildings. With some meat and hides now available, the group decided to use some of their wood to build drying racks. They needed a few different types for different purposes, some for drying meat for preservation, and others for drying out hides in order to process them into leather. That evening, Oiwun put the finishing touches on the last of the new buildings, which would be great, except now that Apple had joined, they would need one more room for her. With the need for a new bedroom, and their need for a space to store rock chunks where they could be shaped into bricks, Oiwun began planning out a small room that she intended to mine into the side of the hill. She thought it was a fun idea to have their stone cutting room built into the hillside. The stonework was probably still a little ways off, but given that they fully expected to come under attack from many different factions, it seemed sensible to ensure that as much of their town as possible was constructed out of stone, to minimise the chances of them losing absolutely everything in a fire. With the field of hay grass planted, Oiwun also threw together a couple of drying racks down by the field, so that they could use them to process the hay once it was grown. That afternoon, whilst Oiwun began working on her new home, another trade ship from the guild arrived. Yera extracted herself from her research bench long enough to go and barter with them. She managed to trade a decent chunk of their ample lumber supplies in exchange for some meat and veg, just to help keep them going until more of their fields were ready to harvest. It turned out that most of the space that Oiwun had designated for a new cave consisted of iron ore. They didn't have a use for something that advanced at the moment, but with so much of it being extracted as a byproduct of Oiwun's mining, they decided to set up a barrel to store it in, located in the central shelter. Seeing the pellets on the ground, and knowing that they hoped to turn them into leather, Yera also suggested adding additional barrels for leather and textiles. In the interest of improving the ever-poor moods of his people, Gunther suggested that they build a table and some benches for them to sit at, where they could enjoy their meals together. There wasn't quite enough room inside the main shelter building, however, so in the interest of getting a dry area set up for them to eat as quickly as possible, he instructed Hoyt to erect a gazebo in front of the shelter, using 4 wooden columns and some roofing. Another reason to avoid spending the wood on a new building was that Louisa had finally managed to tame one of the wild horses nearby, which meant they'd need a large pen to keep it in. If they could make a pen large enough, then they could probably maintain the horse on grazing alone. Louisa worked with Hoyt to begin planning out the pen, which would take up a large portion of the area to the south of the current buildings. With a lot of hard work, they managed to get the pen completed just as night was beginning to fall, allowing Louisa to rope up their first mare and guide it back to its new home. No stranger to hard work, Oiwun had not only finished up the pen, but had also cleared enough space in her cave to set up a bed, allowing everyone in the group to have their own bed for the night. Checking on the horse the next day, Louisa noticed a bit of an issue with the pen. It would probably provide plenty of grazing room for this horse, but if they managed to tame more, which he did intend to do, then their rate of grazing would rapidly outgrow what the pen could maintain. After apologising profusely to Oilwound for messing up so badly, they worked together to once more plan out a further expansion to the pen, to hopefully offer a bit of future-proofing to this new horse breeding operation of theirs. Eager to prove the usefulness of the horses, Louisa insisted that Hoyt ride the horse to speed up his tasks for the day. This wasn't quite the showcase of increased productivity that Louisa had hoped, however, as Hoyt hopped on the horse, rode up to the shelter, and then immediately tied it up so that he could spend the day inside the shelter cooking. With the pen extension finally finished later that night, the builders could get back to working on the gazebo. They started by moving the drying racks, putting up the roof, and throwing together the table and chairs. To celebrate the completion of this task, Hoyt treated himself to the first seat at the table and christened it with his breakfast. Although things had been relatively peaceful so far, the group knew that their attempts to set up a new country which was exclusively for the races of the Old Realm would anger and invite attacks from not only the humans, who may feel threatened, but even from some of the Old Realm races themselves, who may wish to stop the group from rocking the boat out of fear of what it might mean for the rest of them. With this knowledge at the forefront of their minds, they knew that security and defensive measures should be high on their priority list. The peninsula didn't have overly defensible natural features, so they would need to put a fair bit of effort into making it safer. The first measure, of many, was to build some cavalry spikes along a line joining the bottom of the horse pen. This would give them somewhere to hold with a little cover and would hopefully slow down any attackers. They hoped that the spikes would funnel the attackers into the narrow opening between the two rows, where they would lay down some wooden spike traps to dish out hurt to any attackers. They also made plans to trim back the trees in the area, to ensure that the elves could get clean shots at anyone approaching. It seemed that the trolls burrowed in front of the new defences considered the construction work to be a nuisance, and one of the trolls emerged from the burrow, intent on putting an end to that nuisance. Uncertain on how strong the troll was, Prentice and Guthor retreated, whilst the others closed in on their yells. It almost seemed that the troll was giving up the chase, but they couldn't have it attacking them whenever they went back near the defences, so the group turned and sent arrows its way. The troll went into a fit of rage and began charging at Guthor, its anger thankfully blinding it to the dazed and confused Hoyt as he wandered past. As it continued to single-mindedly chase after Guthor, the others managed to riddle it with arrows, and Oilwound came charging at it on horseback. Seemingly realising the direness of its situation, the troll turned to attack the nearby Yera instead, but it was already too late. It had taken plenty of damage already, and Oilwound's heavy club sealed its fate as it swung for the troll's head. Having focused her attention the last few days on understanding how to grow a wider variety of crops, Yera next turned her attention to creating more powerful bows, in the interests of further improving their ability to defend themselves. It seems as though some of the local fauna had taken lessons from the troll, and a small ewe-tyrannus decided to try and make a meal out of Oilwound. The group had also learned well from the troll, however, and as Oilwound pulled back, Prentice and Guthor moved into position to launch arrows at the ewe-tyrannus from both sides. Undeterred, the ewe-tyrannus continued its chase of Oilwound, only to meet the heavy end of Oilwound's club, putting it out of commission in one fell swoop. Despite Guthor's best efforts, moods were still rock bottom in the group, and were only going to get worse, Prentice launching into an insulting spree, and Kayla throwing a tantrum. Guthor and Prentice threw hands soon after, snapping Prentice out of it. The pain of the fight, however, was unlikely to make either of them feel much better. Once they'd all calmed down a little, Guthor worked with Oilwound and Hoyt to plan out some additional creature comforts in each of the group's bedrooms, in the hopes that making the rooms a little nicer would keep them all a little bit happier. Turning their attentions back to their defences, Yera suggested that they try and cut off any other avenues of attack, forcing any enemies to go through their central defences. To achieve this, she suggested lining the other gaps between the entrance to the peninsula and Ysera's Perch with simple wooden palisades. These would of course be susceptible to fire, and ideally would be replaced with stone at the earliest convenience, but for now they should help out at least a little. With their abundant lumber supplies and excellent construction crew, the first of the walls was completed by the end of the very next day. In the interest of preventing attackers from simply walking up to the wall and setting it alight, Louisa suggests adding spikes to the outside of it. That way, even if someone does try to approach the wall, they'd likely cause themselves some damage in the process. With the speed of that task, the construction crew were confident they could expand the wall to the east, out to the edge of the beach, hopefully closing off one entire side of the settlement from attacks. In fact, when the group saw the speed with which the construction crew were able to erect the spikes, Guthor suggested that they extend them to cover the whole outer perimeter of the horse pen. As the defences were going up, the first of the potatoes were being harvested back at the centre of the settlement. Of course, this string of successes couldn't go unpunished, and the vile plague reared its ugly head once more, although this time it only chose to strike down Hoyt. Directing him to rest in Oiwund's cave, in order to keep him away from the others, Guthor began tending to Hoyt. Without any medicine, the quality of his work suffered a little, but there was no more wild heal root on the peninsula for them to gather, so they would simply have to make do without. Being a member of the construction crew, Hoyt insisted that Oiwund continue to maintain the high standard of speed they'd set for themselves, and insisted that she continue to hollow out the cave even as he rested in it. She was freeing up space in the cave in which to store the chunks, which would later be processed into bricks. Despite the lack of medicine, the night ended with Hoyt looking to be on an upward swing, hoping to beat the sickness and get back to his construction tasks as soon as possible. Hoyt's predicament, however, did make Prentice realise that they badly needed to start growing their own herbal medicine for future illnesses. In order to grow the crop a little quicker, she suggested that they work the soil before planting it, to speed things up. With the potato harvest coming in alongside another radish harvest, it seemed as though the food situation may finally be evening out a little, freeing up the group's time from endless fishing and allowing them to progress further faster. Unfortunately, the pain and discomfort of his illness had left Hoyt in a foul mood, and he felt that bringing down others was his only recourse, escaping his sickbed to launch into a tirade of bile spewing against his friends. Escaping from his sickbed was not without consequences though. His treatment hadn't been successful enough to overcome the illness without the additional benefit of a good night's rest. And as he stomped around the settlement shouting abuse at his comrades, his health took a dive. After a few hours of shouting himself hoarse, he finally returned to his bed, but unfortunately, the damage was done. The next morning, as the group rose to start their day, Hoyt succumbed to his sickness, never to rise again. Good morning, afternoon, evening, or night, whichever it is, wherever you are. Tuna here, just stopping by with my usual thanks to you guys for watching the video. I'm pretty happy with how this one turned out, and pretty stoked to continue the series. The medieval overhaul mod just has so much to it that I've been wanting to do a decent playthrough of it for ages, so now is the time. I will of course be dropping new episodes regularly, so please do subscribe if you want to be notified when those land, and consider dropping a like if you enjoyed your time here with us. I appreciate you all, I hope life is treating you well, and that you're looking after yourselves. Thank you, and until next time, bye bye.